Everyone, and welcome to our second edition of Shaper Talks, featuring DC Shapers talking about pressing issues and sharing some of our fun opinions in a casual conversation setting. My name is Alex Wirth, and I am the co-founder and CEO of Quorum.
And I'm Steven Olikara. I'm the founder and president of the Millennial Action Project.
And we are really excited to be here today to talk about political entrepreneurship. So we're going to jump right in and with a question for Steven.
Yeah.
Steven, how would you define political entrepreneurship?
Well, I think our viewers are probably familiar with social entrepreneurship. And in social entrepreneurship, you're often taking on problems like the environment or immigration or education, all very pressing issues, and often utilizing innovative entrepreneurial approaches that disrupt existing paradigms in those spaces. So, for example, I've had friends who start innovative charter schools with totally different business models or new clean energy startups. And those could be for-profit or non-profit. With political entrepreneurship, it's that same model directed at political issues and democracy. And I think this idea of political entrepreneurship is now increasingly important because my view is democracy really is the calling of our time. If you look at the ways that our political system is breaking down and the worsening polarization, dysfunction we're seeing, we're currently living in the largest and longest government shutdown ever. And so we need these innovative approaches, and I think political entrepreneurship best captures that. And Alex, you've been a political entrepreneur, and you've talked about how it's important for people to be involved in improving our nation's politics outside of the traditional things like joining a campaign or maybe voting, which are both very important. So tell us more about your own personal journey. How did you become interested in politics and public affairs originally? And then how did that lead you to being a political entrepreneur? And tell us a little bit about Quorum as well.
Yeah, happy to. So I grew up in Santa Fe, New Mexico, born and raised there, and a sixth-generation New Mexican, and got very involved early on in the political process in many traditional ways. So I served on my school's student council. I volunteered for a whole series of campaigns, both as I was young and growing up and going to campaign rallies, and then very actively in the 2008 presidential campaign.
Right.
And then the big one is I chaired the Santa Fe Mayor's Youth Advisory Board, which was set up by the mayor to bring more perspectives of children and young people into the political perspective and the dialogue and the conversation. And so would say that I originally got engaged through a lot of very traditional means of opportunities that were already created on existing structures to come and participate in the process. And that is absolutely essential. And I think the message here today is that you need to both be engaged in those traditional ways that are set up, but also for those that are excited, there's a step further to take it.
Right.
And that's really about how you create your own space or come up with something new that you think could add a tremendous amount of value to our democracy, to our political system.
Right.
So that, for me, was the campaign for a presidential youth council, where I realized, along with a whole group of folks at the national level, that we had all of these structures set up to engage young people at both the local level and the state level, but we didn't have the same thing set up federally.
Right.
And so I led for about 3.5 years a nationwide effort to get more young people engaged and to try and create a presidential youth council of young Americans to advise the president. And so that was groundbreaking in that it had never been done before. And suddenly here I was running this 100-organization coalition trying to get more young people involved, and ended up on Capitol Hill actually doing advocacy work. And specifically, we wanted members of Congress to sign on to the resolution and to show their support so that we could hopefully convince the president that, hey, this was a good idea.
Right.
And it was through that process that I ran into head all along about how is it possible to navigate the legislative process, and who do we go to talk to if we want to get them to sign on to a bill. And realized firsthand that it's really hard if you're an advocate on Capitol Hill.
Yeah.
And so came back to my university where I was studying undergrad and had some conversations with my college roommate around this process is really difficult, there's got to be a way to make it easier. And my college roommate studied computational biochemistry and the analytics between protein networks.
Yeah.
And what we figured out is that if you take the same code that's used to analyze protein networks and apply that to congressional networks, we can map out who every member of Congress works with most frequently. And so that was the spark that has since led to Quorum,
Right.
Which is the software and public affairs software company that I now run. We're 70 people based in downtown DC, but taking a for-profit business approach towards how do we really change the way that people interact with politics.
Right.
And have really completed a lot of my evolution of starting early on from a really traditional engagement to breaking out and doing something on my own in the political spectrum.
Right.
Now, what's exciting about this conversation today is that we have both my perspective here, but then also Steven. And Steven comes at it from the nonprofit side with the Millennial Action Project, which is doing just fantastic work. But Steven, return the question to you. How did you originally get the idea for the Millennial Action Project? And why did you decide to approach it from a nonprofit perspective? And what have you learned through that process over the course of, I think, the last 6-7 years you've been doing it?
Officially, we just had our 5th anniversary, but I was working on it even a bit before Millennial Action Project launched. Well, it's a good question. I grew up in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, playing music. I was not your political nerd. I was not the guy who was doing debate club. I was not in forensics. I was not going to local political meetings. I was a musician growing up. And what I liked about music the most was, in a very highly segregated and polarized environment in Milwaukee, music had a unique ability to transcend a lot of divisions. And that led to me becoming a radio DJ in Milwaukee. I often joke I was the #1 jazz DJ in Milwaukee, one of one. There wasn't that much competition. But so I was playing jazz music, and I had my bands, and I wanted to figure out civically how do you do the same thing, because I realized what is amazing about American democracy is that you have this fusion of ideas. Like James Madison talked about in the Federalist Papers, he envisioned a large, diverse democracy with a competition of ideas. Through that process, you advance the public interest. But of course, we're headed in the opposite direction right now. Worsening tribalism, demonization, and fear, and that becomes an existential threat to democracy. That's what led to my interest in politics. At the time, it happened to be when Barack Obama was getting very involved and running for president, and his campaign was essentially this idea that we're not just red states or blue states, we can be the United States. So I got involved very unexpectedly on the campaign where they asked me to open for Obama at a rally. And since then, I've been trying to pursue this mission ever since then. Fast forward to 2013, and we realized that these trends continue to go in a very troubling direction. Just one example, the current level of partisan polarization in Congress is the worst it's been since the end of Reconstruction. And so that's what my friends and I, who are starting Millennial Action Project, saw. We have this worsening division, but also a historic new generation of millennials who are running for office. And the question becomes, how is this next generation going to govern our country? Will we have the tools and means and the relationships to transcend some of these divisions? Or are we going to continue on this track of greater division and tribalism, which will ultimately lead to the downfall of democracy? And so that's what led to founding Millennial Action Project, or MAP for short. And our model is very simple. We activate young legislators at the beginning of their public service careers, help them bridge the partisan divide. We help them on the relationship building side and the network building, as well as on identifying policy opportunities, because most of the policy making is done in a partisan way. And we try and amplify that and change the political narrative so longer term, young people do see politics as a vehicle for creating impact. So that's what we've been able to do. But one of the big challenges as a young political entrepreneur is just figuring out, how do you start an organization? How do you manage a team? And you have to perform really well early on for people to take you seriously. And I suspect those are some lessons you've learned in the entrepreneurship process. So tell us, how did you learn to be a CEO? And how did you develop your abilities to now manage this pretty large team you have here at Quorum?
Yeah. So I think what's so interesting about political entrepreneurship, both for-profit and non-profit, is that it revolves around some of the same fundamentals. And so this advice really applies whether or not you want to go a nonprofit route or a for-profit route, because it can get you towards the same direction. And it also applies to if you want to go to a company that's entirely outside of politics or a nonprofit that's completely outside of politics. But really at the core of it is you need to have an idea that resonates and that people are really excited about, can rally around, because you need those people either to come work for you, you need those people to donate to your cause, you need those people to attend events, to buy your product if you have a product, but really to get people galvanized and excited about.
Right.
The best way to do that is obviously do a lot of brainstorming. You need to come up with something, but then to go to talk to 30 people in the industry and ask them, hey, I'm thinking about this, would it be helpful? So maybe in your case, what you likely did is talk to some millennial legislators.
Yeah, that's right.
And when you started, there was a few and growing, but said, hey, if we do this and bring people together, would you be willing to work with each other? For us, we went and talked with a whole series of folks that worked in advocacy, and I literally called up every person in Washington I knew that worked on Capitol Hill and said, hey, here's what we're doing, what do you think? And so getting that initial spark is what's helpful, and then getting some of the early momentum that comes behind it. And then honestly, some of the best places of advice that I've gotten have come from other entrepreneurs that are doing the same thing.
Yeah.
And usually I found it's helpful to look to people that are a year or 2 years ahead who've overcome some of the same challenges of, okay, how do you hire your first group of people? Or even the fun one, Steve and I, before we went live, had a whole conversation around vacation policy.
Yeah.
And thinking about what is the appropriate that you should set with the company and the business. And the big thing that I think we have learned over the course of 5 years of doing Quorum is that a lot of these challenges and problems have been solved before. Right. So you should really look externally for advice and guidance, whether that's in person, whether that's going to a conference. There's so many books out there on it. Steve Blank, 4 Steps to an Epiphany, is a great resource. But to really know that there's resources out there, and so if you've got an idea that you're really passionate about and have a lot of people telling you, hey, that's a great idea, you should go do it, it's something you seriously should consider. Yeah. Now, an element that I want to talk a little bit about on this is that once you have that idea, the next question that comes up is funding.
Yeah. And
how do you fund it? Stephen, curious, how did you guys get your early funding to get up and off the ground, and how have you found a revenue stream to this day?
Definitely. So as you mentioned, Alex, we are a nonprofit, a 501c3 nonprofit, so there's no model of, getting venture capitalists or angel investors, but you do need to secure support from donors early on. And I've heard so many different stories of how this process works, because it's kind of a crazy thing to do if you think about it. In our case, I think the most important thing is, and you referenced this, identifying a relevant idea. And to some degree, the market will direct money towards ideas that matter. But that's not enough. I think it was Einstein who said, vision without execution is hallucination. And so you also need to take that to the next step of building a credible team, and then start getting the message out there. And so in our case, what happened is we, through our co-founders, identified a couple of donors who were able to get us to our launch event. And in that stage, some people call it the friends and family stage, they're investing really in you as a leader. The concept, your business plan, is probably secondary to that, because you have no track record, you have no record of results. And so we get to our launch. After that, the government shuts down, and our whole issue, the need for a new generation of leaders that does a better job of governing our country, is one of the big news stories. We got on every major political news television show, and a couple of foundations started reaching out to us. It turned out the first foundation had heard me give a 1-minute pitch of MAP at a conference this prior summer, and we didn't even meet at that conference. And so he started following me online, and then he finally reached out. And I think that story ultimately underscores maybe a more essential truth here, which is you can interpret that as luck, you can interpret that as coincidence, that he was there at that conference and then he happened to be following us and then decided to support us at the exact right time. Because trust me, we were pretty much out of money. Like when we got to our launch, the seed funding money was used. So we needed really some big foundations to come in. But I would say it's potentially something deeper than luck and coincidence. It's, I think, the universe speaking to us in those moments. And one of my favorite books is called The Alchemist, a very simple book. Highly recommend you read it. But it talks about how when you walk in your purpose, the universe conspires for your success. And it also says when you try and find your purpose, you often have to go down the least convenient route or the less convenient route. You have to take big leaps of faith. And so I felt pretty strongly in 2013, I felt in my gut that this was an important thing to do. And then all of a sudden, the stars started to align in ways that I could not have predicted. Doesn't mean it's going to be easy. Normally, after you get some, in the book they call it beginner's luck, you get some beginner's luck, get an early success, then you fall into an abyss, like a character challenging abyss where you really have to dig yourself out. And so I'm a big believer in the universe, and And I think that applies to a lot of novel concepts that folks who are watching this might be thinking, if I want to start something new, make sure it's the right thing in your heart, and usually things work out.
So this is actually really interesting because I've heard the same piece of advice but described a little bit differently.
Really?
It's actually one of the most helpful things for us. And basically the idea is that you're going off-roading with a Jeep and you're going on a journey. And you will feel at some point you start to get to momentum and you're going straight uphill, life feels great, probably a little bit like you guys, all this press, attention, wow, my ideas just hit off, like this is great. And then at some point that'll fade, and basically how it's described to me is you're going to drive the Jeep into the woods and you're just going to be flat out lost.
Exactly.
And you're not going to know anywhere of where you're going, it's not going to be up or down, it just seems like the woods just never end.
Yeah.
And so many ideas, companies, nonprofits fail in that lost in the woods stage.
That's
because
right.
they get there and you go, well, I'm just not sure what's happening to be going. But then at some point, you're going to get out of the woods and start climbing again. And that's really, once you get through that first stage, when you know, yep, we've made it, we're there.
Yeah.
And certainly I think we at Quorum early on had our own moment where we were like, well, wait, we thought we had good product market fit, we had all this momentum, where are we? And I will never forget when we came out of that Lost in the Woods stage again, I was like, wow, this is awesome. But certainly we're there. And it was actually right around the same time that Taylor Swift's Out of the Woods song had come out.
See?
So I have to say that it was pretty funny to listen to, of like, out of the woods, are we out of the woods yet?
Yeah.
Right as we were coming out.
Where do you get the out of the woods metaphor? Where does that come from?
So somebody came and talked to a startup class that I was involved in, and they just said, hey, this is, what happens.
Yeah.
But same thing of the abyss, just described a little differently. I think it's very true.
Yeah, and I think if you can anticipate that process, which, I don't know about you, that has played out every single time I've tried to affect change in my life. Change personally, but also change professionally. Trying to start any new initiative, it's been the same cycle. So if you can actually anticipate that cycle, then you won't be so hard on yourself when you're facing tough times, and you won't be questioning whether you went on that route. I mean, certainly that happens at times because this is really tough work, but I think if you can anticipate it a bit more, then it makes the process a little bit easier. So what do you do when you face hardships or setbacks here at Quorum, both in your own personal life to kind of clear your head, or in other ways, like do you have any tips of how, for entrepreneurs who might be watching, what do you do when you face setbacks?
Yeah. So I think you need a really good support network of people who are also in it with you.
Yeah.
I was fortunate enough that started Quorum and still to this day run Quorum with my college roommate and co-founder Jonathan Marks.
Yeah.
And so we are very close. We still live together to this day. But it provides just a wonderful opportunity to just bounce consistent ideas back and forth off of. And both with him, but also with other members of our team, external advisors, having somebody to call and go to, really, really helpful.
Right.
Because again, the thing that you learn is that people have experienced a lot of the same problems. And certainly you get to a stage where you go, wow, look what Maps accomplished, or look at Quorum and how big it is, that's so amazing. It takes a lot of hard work to get there. And there are people who have done the same things and worked and scaled it who go, oh yeah, I've been there, and here's how I solved it or did this. I think it's also fair to say that not everything's going to go perfectly, and part of the honest conversations to have, and why I actually think this is a good medium, is to be honest about that. And say that building a nonprofit, building a company, building a movement is hard. I mean, you look at the Women's March, who, a year ago had their first moment of scale up, wow, this is so amazing, look at all the folks that are coming out and participating. It might have been 2 years ago. Specifically, and then now it's having a little bit of their in the woods moment of there's still people participating, but there's internal divisions, what's happening, what's going on. And so that hardship's going to come. Sometimes it's more public, sometimes it's less public, but I think it's important to be open and honest that doing entrepreneurship is just hard in general, but you can achieve some absolutely incredible outcomes. And so to transition a little bit on the hard, I think the question that I just kind of popped in my mind is why do it? And really how I would answer that, and I'm going to toss this over to you, it's the same question, is that we have these really significant challenges that are not going to be solved just by standard participation. Yes, we need everyone to go vote. Yes, we need more people to go work on campaigns, whether it's Democrat, Republican. Yes, we need more people to go and testify in the city council or participate in the state legislature. But what we really need is we need more people actively trying to move and shape the political process. Because some of the traditional structures that we have set up and the system that we have clearly isn't working. And I think it's so interesting that we sit here in the middle of the longest government shutdown in U.S. history, where it's clear that the two sides are not coming together. There's not the same bridges that there used to be, and there's so much room for improvement. And what's kind of interesting about this conversation is that I think you cite the last government shutdown as being pretty significant for MAP in terms of increasing and getting off the ground. It's also what served for some of the initial spark for Quorum of John and me sitting in our dorm room being like, really, this is the best we can do? Here we are as the #1 country in the world, and our political system we can take to the next level and expect more from. And so if there was a call to action, if you are sitting there at home feeling that same way, we can expect more from our political system, and feel that whether it's about the U.S. Congress, your state legislature, local level, or just a particular issue that you're not happy with, there's incredible opportunity to get involved and to be able to do it, whether it's for-profit, non-profit, or even without an organization at all, of pushing a movement and a campaign. But I guess would ask you, okay, why do it? All this hardship, really difficult journey. Why participate?
Yeah, a couple of reasons. One, personally, I couldn't read the newspaper anymore without feeling like I had some avenue to be part of the solution. I actually remember distinctly in, I guess it was 2012, I was working at the World Bank at the time, and having some of the early conversations and meetings for MAP, I would read the New York Times or Wall Street Journal late at night while I'm working on my business plan, and I realized I cannot read these articles anymore without having an outlet for it. But still, I knew that jumping into it full time was a whole nother deal, and ultimately, it's actually appropriate to mention this today. At the time, I went on a run by the Dr. King Memorial. And that's what inspired me to actually take the leap of faith, because I had this realization standing in front of that wall. You see all the quotes etched in there, just iconic convictions about life that he's articulating there. Each and every word there was delivered by a man who was our age. He was in his 20s and 30s. He was 26 when he led the Montgomery bus boycott. He was 34 when he gave the I Have a Dream speech. And most of the organizing he did was when he was millennial aged, which is where we are right now. And so it struck me that now is really the time to try it. And ultimately, our time on this planet is pretty short. So, you want to be able to do something that you think is impactful. So that was the first reason. The second reason is, if you just project out to where we're going right now, this idea of political pluralism and democracy is really important in the grand scheme of human history. And my family is immigrant family. I'm first generation. My parents came over from India, and we moved to a 98% Caucasian community in Wisconsin, just outside of Milwaukee. The idea that we can move there, be integrated into the society, and then co-create so many things together in terms of education, in terms of jobs and economic opportunity, and culturally have our different backgrounds fused together with food and with music, that is unique in the whole course of human history. So I think this idea of democracy is really, really important, and we can't take it for granted. It's still relatively young, and that's why I'm really in this fight as hard as I can be, because if we continue down this route, then we won't be able to have this great innovation where people of different backgrounds can coexist and create a better society.
Great answer. Yeah. Very, very compelling. I think the other aspect, on just even more practical note, that you touch on a little bit, and I think it's so powerful that you talk about Martin Luther King today, but it's also just realizing that you have a window to do something entrepreneurial, usually when you're younger.
Yeah,
and
that's
what
right.
ends up happening is I'll talk to a lot of folks who are in their 40s, 50s, and they go, what you're doing is so cool, I wish I could go do that, but I'm married and I have kids and I have a mortgage and I just can't jump off the cliff and go do it.
Yeah.
And it really, that makes you realize of okay, when your commitments are much less, when you've got lots of opportunity in life to think about and a lot of energy and you're ready to go and put in the late nights, the early mornings, the long plane flights to go make it happen.
Yeah.
It creates this window to do it, and so you kind of take advantage of it. And then what's interesting is once you get the bug, then you're going to feel more comfortable doing it in the future. But certainly in terms of taking a risk, some of the trade-offs are a little bit easier to do when you're younger.
Yeah, I think there is more risk tolerance when you're younger, and these endeavors inherently have a lot of risk. And then what you have to then face is, how comfortable am I with failure? Like, how comfortable would you be if this whole thing doesn't work out? Or you're in the woods for 2 or 3 years and then you finally make your way out. That's not for everyone, to be honest. But if you're interested in entrepreneurship, I think you do have to be very, very comfortable with failure and be willing to take on that risk and say, you know what? My resume maybe is not the most important thing. How good it looks, whether I have all the blue chips on my resume. In some cases, it may be important. But I think if you're going down this route, you have to be comfortable with, you know what? It might not work out and I might have to switch gears and do something else. But
so what's interesting on that is, I'll say this looking at it from the other end of now an employer, where we see thousands of resumes every year. We're actively recruiting and working on getting people to join Quorum. And one of the things that we really like to see are entrepreneurs. Because when you think about people to come join your team and what you want on your team, you want people who are entrepreneurial. You want people who are going to take risks, who are going to go and own the execution and really get the job done. And there are things where maybe the idea just wasn't great, maybe the team wasn't there, or the funding wasn't there, or mistakes are going to happen, and failures are going to happen. That's going to happen in everyone's career. But it's the ability to go and do something really significant and try and do that in general ends up as having a pretty good precursor to saying that you would have success at a future entity. Even in the case of failure, it's something that many big businesses and even smaller ones like Quorum look really positively. Now, obviously not saying you can't go and do the Fry Festival and just have a complete screw up that right. The New York Times covers and it all goes downhill. So you need to have a graceful exit and find the opportunities for soft landing after your failure. But that being said, it's okay to fail, and something like 90% of startups do. It's going to take a while to get it right. You may go do a second thing, you may go work for a blue chip and then go and start another thing, but realizing that you do need to be involved. The other piece about it that I think is so exciting is that not only will you get better over time that you do it, but you're also going to meet so many more connections and so many more people. You're going to understand the problems better, and you won't repeat past mistakes, and be able to really set yourself up for success going forward.
Yeah, that really resonates with us too, because we're actively hiring, and the idea of looking for just the most a list of the most prestigious things has turned out to not necessarily yield the best talent. The best people, we've hired are those who are, like you said, entrepreneurial. They're hungry. They care about getting the practical things done, and I think that's a really important lesson for all of us. And the other big insight I learned from building something from scratch is one of the and this might be one of the big takeaways is, one of, if not the most important thing you do, is building a great team. And I did a lot of research on Dr. King, on prior Dr. King days, actually, because I was curious because he was a political entrepreneur in his day, not just a famous orator, but he had a nonprofit behind him, the Southern Christian Leadership Council. And I was wondering, okay, so how did he get funding? Who did his books? Who ran the shop there? And there's a great book called Bearing the Cross that describes a lot of this. And he faced the same challenges that we're talking about, which made me feel pretty good when I had my in the woods moment. And, he was worried about meeting payroll in the mid-1960s. And this point about building a team, so important. He hired someone named Ella Baker to run the SELC, and she was the one really making sure that it was run properly. He also had another gentleman from New York who was his pro bono lawyer, accountant, fundraiser, and so he had a really strong team, and I think that's what helped him be successful.
I know we're coming up here on the top of the hour. Figure probably it'd be appropriate to end with resources.
Yes,
so the idea to encourage other people to become involved. So curious, off the top of your head, if you have go-to resources, books like that you found to be really helpful, people, websites, email newsletters, recommendations on that.
Yeah, that's a very good question. Well, first of all, two of my favorite books are, I've already mentioned, The Alchemist and Bearing the Cross by David Garrow, and also a big fan of the Stephen Covey book, what's it called? Eight successful, successful tips for being a good entrepreneur, and that has a lot of good lessons as well. And I just say reading in general, I think is super important as an entrepreneur and like actually making time for it. In terms of politics, I would say actually go to our website, www.millennialaction.org. We have a lot of resources there and different links to different things. But how about for yourself? What would you recommend?
So a couple places to start. Obviously, you should look at some of the fantastic organizations that are in this space. But also what's particularly interesting is to look at the funders and have a conversation with the funders around what they're looking at. So Knight Foundation has been very active. The Hewlett Foundation, the Omidyar Network, and their Democracy Fund have been very active. And so looking at who are their grantees, and they've done a lot of research on the space and may even be open to having a conversation with you about the idea that you're working on.
The Foundation Center, too, which has a lot of just a whole list of foundations based on issue area that you could look at.
I think that's excellent. The books that I've found really helpful, as I mentioned, 4 Steps to an Epiphany, really great about how you take an idea from zero and actually turn it into something and really make sure that it works well. The other one is Jim Collins' Good to Great, which wrote a book basically around what makes the good companies great, and looked at historical stock performance and then analyzed the qualitative factors in the company.
Yeah.
And that really helped us early on and think a lot about what are the best structures. The other really good one is Ben Horowitz, The Hard Thing About Hard Things.
Oh, yeah.
Who is the Horowitz and Andreessen Horowitz, one of the major venture capital firms. And so I've found him to been very helpful. And then there's a series of newsletters as well. OpenView does a really good one. There's one like the Founders Collective, I believe, that's pretty good. That also comes out on Saturdays. And then SaaStr does a newsletter if you're more interested in the software space. That just provide really good content. And there's a lot of people out there that are blogging about it, they're writing about it. The other one, and the last one they'll end on, is written by the founder of Moz, Lost and Founder. And he writes, I think, the most helpful open book about running a startup, where he breaks down all the myths, very honest about revenue numbers, here's the experience, here's what happened to him.
Yeah.
And so I would highly recommend that for people looking at what the next resource might be.
Nice.
We're probably going to have to wrap it up here, but I'm curious, any last tips or things to share?
Well, I just remembered the name of the book. It's 8 Habits of Highly Successful People. That's what I was thinking of. But no, we're here at Quorum headquarters. Thanks for hosting us here, Alex, and great to do this conversation. I think you've been one of the people I've talked to a number of times over the past years as a fellow political entrepreneur, and really appreciate all of the ways that we've worked together. So if anyone has questions, definitely feel free to comment, and we'll do our best to respond to any questions you have. And thanks to our curators here in the DC Hub for coming up with the idea of our peer-to-peer Shaper Talks.
Fantastic.
Bye.
Alex Wirth.
Steven Olikara, thanks so much, guys.